6 days. No food, no fire. Temperature dropping so fast the sweat on Rhett Mercer's collar had turned to ice before he even realized he was sweating. He'd tracked killers across 3 territories, survived ambushes, survived betrayal, survived things that had broken better men than him. But out here, alone on a Montana ridge in the dead of winter, with the wind screaming through the pines like something that wanted him dead, he was losing, and he knew it. Then the smell hit him. Wood smoke, something cooking, something that meant someone was out here, in the middle of nowhere, waiting. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The cold had a personality out here. That was the thing nobody told you before you rode into the Montana Highlands in January. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a presence. It pressed down on your shoulders. It got inside your coat, inside your boots, inside the spaces between your thoughts, until thinking itself became sluggish and unreliable. Rhett Mercer had been riding and walking and crawling through it for 6 days, and by the morning of the 7th, the cold had stopped feeling like an enemy and started feeling like the only thing left that was real. His horse was gone. Lost 2 days back when the animal had put a leg through a frozen creek shelf and gone down hard. Rhett had done what needed doing and kept walking. He hadn't let himself think too long about it. Thinking too long about any one thing out here was how men died. He had a rifle with 4 rounds left, a revolver with 2, a bedroll that had gotten soaked through on the second night and never fully dried. Half a strip of jerky he'd been rationing like it was the last food on earth, because as far as he could tell, it was. His badge was still pinned to his coat, Deputy U.S. Marshal, out of the Helena office, though it had started to feel less like an identity and more like a small, useless piece of metal that weighed nothing and meant nothing out here, where the only law was survival. He'd been tracking a man named Cole Dutton. 3 murders across 2 counties, a bank robbery that had left a teller dead, and a family of 4 without a father. Rhett had picked up the trail outside of Butte and followed it north into the Highlands, certain he was closing in, certain Dutton was just ahead. And then the blizzard had come on the 3rd night and swallowed every track, every sign, every thread of certainty Rhett had been holding on to. He'd kept going anyway. That was the job. That was also, if he was being honest with himself, stubbornness dressed up to look like duty. By morning of day 6, he had accepted the basic arithmetic of his situation. He was somewhere northeast of the main pass, probably a day's walk from the lower elevation timber, possibly 2 days given how his legs were moving. He had no food. His core temperature had been dropping since yesterday afternoon. He could feel it in the particular heaviness behind his eyes, the way his fingers kept fumbling at simple tasks. He'd built a fire the night before, but the wood had been wet and the smoke had been thick and wrong-colored, and he'd slept maybe 3 hours before the fire died and the cold woke him up by reaching inside his chest. He was going to die up here. He'd made his peace with that somewhere around midnight. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic left in him. He'd just looked up at the stars through a gap in the pines and thought, well, that's probably how it goes then. And then he'd gotten up and kept walking, because lying down and accepting it felt worse than fighting it, even when fighting it was pointless. That was when the smell reached him. Wood smoke first. Clean, dry wood smoke, which meant whoever had that fire knew what they were doing. Dry wood, good draft, not the desperate wet wood smoking he'd been managing. And beneath it, something else. Something that stopped him mid-step on that frozen ridge and made him stand very still because his brain was producing the smell of food, and he didn't trust his brain anymore. He didn't trust anything his body was telling him. He'd been wrong too many times in the last 2 days, but the smell didn't go away. It got stronger. Rhett unslung his rifle, not because he was planning anything. His hands weren't steady enough to plan anything, but because he'd been in enough bad situations to know that a fire in the middle of nowhere could mean a lot of things, and not all of them were salvation. He followed the smell through a stand of lodgepole pines, up a slight rise, and then down into a protected hollow he never would have found without the smoke leading him. The hollow sat below the ridgeline, sheltered on 3 sides by a natural rock formation that cut the wind almost completely. Someone had found this place deliberately, or had been very lucky. A single canvas structure, part tent, part lean-to, built against the rock face, sat at the center of it, with a stone ring and a proper fire burning in front. Suspended over the fire on a rough iron trivet was a cast iron pot, and whatever was in that pot smelled like the reason people kept believing that things would get better. Rhett stood at the edge of the hollow and didn't move. A shape appeared in the opening of the lean-to. A woman. Medium height, broad-shouldered in a heavy wool coat that had seen hard use, dark hair tucked under a fur-lined hat, and a rifle in her hands that was pointed directly at his chest with the kind of steadiness that came from practice and not nerves. "Step into the firelight," she said. Her voice was flat and unhurried. "Hands where I can see them." Rhett's arms were already partway up. He stepped forward. The firelight caught his face and he watched her eyes move over him. The condition of his coat, the state of his hands, the way he was standing. She was reading him. She was doing it fast and she was doing it well. "How long?" she said. 6 days. "Alone?" "Horse went down 2 days back." Her eyes dropped briefly to his coat, found the badge. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a small recalibration. She didn't lower the rifle, but the angle changed by a few degrees. "You're about to fall over," she said. "I know." "Set the rifle down against that rock. Careful." He did it. His fingers barely cooperated. "Now the sidearm." "Ma'am, I'm not asking twice." He set the revolver down next to the rifle. His hands were shaking badly enough now that he didn't try to hide it. She watched him for another moment, then lowered her rifle and jerked her chin toward the fire. "Sit down before you fall down. There's a log." He made it to the log and sat down, and for about 30 seconds he couldn't do anything else. The heat from the fire hit him like a wall and his whole body started shaking at once. Not from cold, or not just from cold, but from the particular relief of stopping, of not having to keep going anymore, even for a minute. The woman moved around the fire with an efficiency that was almost unsettling. She didn't flutter. She didn't talk. She checked the pot, stirred it once, added a piece of dry wood to the fire from a stack that was cut and stacked with more organization than most line camps he'd seen. Then she produced a tin cup from somewhere, filled it with something from a smaller pot at the edge of the fire, and held it out to him. "Broth first. Not the stew. Your stomach won't handle it yet. Drink this slow." He took the cup. His hands wrapped around it, and the heat was almost painful. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. She sat down on the other side of the fire and picked up her rifle and laid it across her knees. Not threatening, just present. "Who are you?" she said. "Rhett Mercer, Deputy Marshal out of Helena." He took a slow sip of the broth. Salt and something herby and the faintest taste of game meat. It hit his stomach like a match to dry grass. "I was tracking a fugitive, Cole Dutton, third-time killer, robbery out of Butte." "I know who Cole Dutton is," she said. That surprised him enough that he looked up. "You do? Word travels even up here. He came through about 4 days ago." She said it without particular drama, the way someone might mention a weather pattern. "Heading east, toward the Judith Basin." Rhett absorbed that. East. He'd been going north. "You see him? Talk to him?" "I saw him. I didn't let him see me." She paused. "I know the difference between a man passing through and a man looking for trouble. He was looking for trouble. I waited until he was gone, and then I moved my camp." Rhett looked around the hollow. "This isn't your usual spot?" "I have 3. I rotate." She said it like it was obvious. Like everyone maintained 3 camps in the Montana highlands. "How long have you been up here?" "Since October." He did the math. 4 months. Alone, in the highlands, in winter, in a territory where men with full outfits and supply trains struggled to last a season. He looked at her across the fire. She was watching him do the math and not reacting to any of his conclusions. "Tessa Ashcroft," she said. Not warming up exactly, more like deciding he'd earned a name. "You live up here year-round?" "I winter up here. I come down in the spring." She shifted the rifle off her knees and set it within reach. "You were going to die," she said. It wasn't an accusation or a question, just a statement. "Yes. Did you know that?" "I had a pretty clear picture of it." She nodded slowly, like that answer told her something. "The broth is helping?" "It's the best thing I've ever tasted." She almost smiled. Not quite. "That's the hunger talking." "Maybe, but I mean it." She stood and went back to the larger pot and stirred it again. The smell coming off it was extraordinary, deep and layered in a way that didn't make any sense given where they were. He'd eaten in fine hotels. He'd eaten in officers' messes during the war. Whatever was in that pot had no business being this good at 8,000 feet in January. "What is that?" he said. "Elk stew. Wild onion, dried rosehip, pine needle, some salt. Whatever I had." She said it without pride, the way a craftsman talks about a trade. Just facts, just the work. "You made that from ingredients you had up here." "Where else would I get them?" Rhett looked down at his cup. "I've eaten in restaurants that couldn't do what you're doing with whatever you had in that pot." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You can have a bowl when you finish the broth," and your hands stop shaking. His hands were still shaking. He closed them tighter around the cup. "Give me 10 minutes. "Take 20. He did. He sat by that fire in the sheltered hollow and let his body remember that it was still alive. And he watched Tessa Ashcroft move around her camp with a competence that was almost hypnotic. Everything she did was deliberate. No wasted motion, no second guessing. She checked the wind and repositioned a smoke deflector she'd rigged from a piece of oilcloth. She checked the snow on the rock face above them, running her eyes along a particular line he didn't understand. She checked the perimeter of the hollow in a methodical quarter-circle pattern, looking at snow and bark and branches for things only she knew how to read. This was not a woman who'd gotten lucky and stumbled into a good spot. This was a woman who had built a system, and the system worked, and she maintained it the way you maintained anything that kept you alive, constantly, carefully, without drama. When he'd finished the broth and his hands had steadied enough to hold a spoon without spilling, she gave him the stew. He ate it slowly, the way she'd told him to, even though every instinct was screaming at him to eat faster. It was genuinely remarkable. In different circumstances, in a different bowl, with a different name over the door, you could charge money for this. Real money. The kind of money people paid in cities. He said so. She looked at him over the fire. "Don't." Her voice was quiet, but the warning in it was clear. "Don't what?" "Don't tell me what I could do if I were somewhere else. I know what I can do. I made the choices I made." Rhett set the spoon down for a moment. "I wasn't trying to—" "You were trying to compliment me. I understand that. But there's a particular kind of compliment that sounds like telling someone they're wasting themselves, and I've heard it enough times that I'm done being gracious about it." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with an expression that was tired and certain and completely devoid of the kind of softness people usually deployed in these moments to take the edge off. She wasn't angry. She was just done pretending she wasn't right. "Fair enough," he said. She looked mildly surprised, like she'd been braced for him to argue. "I'm sorry," he added. "I said it wrong." She picked up her own cup and drank from it. "The stew is good," she said after a moment. "You're right that it's good. You can say that." "The stew is the best thing I've eaten in longer than I can honestly remember." "That," she said, "I'll take." He slept that afternoon and through the night, and woke up the following morning to the sound of wind above the hollow and the smell of something cooking again. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory. His hands were normal. The heaviness behind his eyes was gone. His feet, he'd been worried about his feet, had some mild frostbite on 2 toes, but nothing catastrophic. He'd gotten lucky. He'd gotten lucky because he'd followed a smell to a hollow where a woman he'd never met had given him broth and stew and a place by her fire. He sat up. Tessa was at the fire doing something with a small skillet. She didn't look over. "You're alive," she said. "Seems so." The wind picked up in the night. Temperature dropped another 12 degrees. She said it the same way she said everything, as information, not drama. "You wouldn't have made it to dawn." He sat with that for a moment. "Then I owe you my life. You owe me a straight answer to a question I'm going to ask you." He waited. She turned from the fire and looked at him directly. "You said Dutton went east. You're out of supplies, no horse, and your hands are still not at full strength. You are not in a condition to track anyone." She paused. "So what are you going to do?" It was a good question. He'd been a marshal long enough to know when his body had hit a hard limit. He was alive today, but he was not functional. Not trail functional, not tracking functional. Cole Dutton had 4 days head start, knew the territory, and had supplies. The honest answer was, he He was not going to catch Cole Dutton. Not from here. Not like this. I need to get to Bozeman, he said. Report in. Get resupplied. See if anyone out of the Judith Bazin office has eyes on Dutton. She nodded like that confirmed something. I'm heading down in 3 days. The weather window should open. She turned back to the skillet. You can travel with me if you want. I know the pass routes. You do. I've made this crossing 11 times. I know which passes are passable in January and which ones look passable and will kill you. He thought about his options. They were not extensive. Why are you heading down now? You said you winter up here. A pause. Just a beat. I have things to do in town. He didn't push it. He'd been a lawman long enough to know when someone was telling him enough and not everything. And this was not a situation where he had any standing to demand more than she was offering. She'd saved his life. She was offering to get him to Bozeman. That was significantly more than he deserved. I'd be grateful for the company, he said. She handed him a plate from the skillet. Some kind of grain cake, flat and dense, with dried berries pressed into it. Simple. Perfect. Eat that, she said. And then I'm going to need you to carry some weight. My pack is overloaded for the first 2 miles, and I can't rebalance it until we get to the cache. Tell me what to carry. You're not going to argue about your hands? My hands are fine enough to carry a pack. They're not fine enough to shoot straight, which means I'm cargo right now, not a marksman. I know what I am. She looked at him for a moment, a different kind of assessment than the one the night before. Less survival calculation, more something else. All right, deputy, she said. Finish that. We'll go over the route. What? The 3 days before the weather window did not pass gently. The wind stayed high and mean, keeping them in the hollow except for the hours when Tessa needed to check her trap lines or gather what she needed for the crossing. She brought Rhett on the second day, partly because she said she needed an extra pair of hands, and partly, he suspected, because she wanted to see how he moved in the terrain before she trusted him as a trail partner. He moved carefully and without complaint. His feet were improving. He kept up. The trap lines produced 2 rabbits, and what Tessa identified as a pine marten, which she dispatched quickly and without sentimentality and began processing with a skill that was matter-of-fact and complete. She used everything. She explained what she was doing without being asked, not teaching exactly, more like someone who thought out loud when they were working and had just stopped filtering it around another person. Where did you learn this? He asked, on the second trapline run, watching her skin the rabbit with a knife that moved in precise, practiced arcs. My mother's family. They spent time with the Crow people. My grandfather worked as a translator for nearly 20 years, and my grandmother learned from the women of the camp. She taught my mother taught me. She didn't look up from the work. The cooking I taught myself. The rest was just necessity after a while. You learn what you need to learn. After a while, he said. How long have you been doing this? Living like this? She was quiet for a moment. 4 years. Since you were 22. She said it before he could finish the calculation, and there was something in how she said it that made it clear the calculation was one she'd made herself, many times, and that the answer had stopped stinging some time ago, or that she'd decided it had. What happened 4 years ago? He asked. She looked up then. Her expression was not hostile, but it was clear. That's a second night question, she said, not a second morning question. He accepted that. He'd learned to accept a lot of things in the last 2 days. Fair. She went back to the rabbit. The wind pushed through the pines above them with a sound like running water. You were tracking Dutton for 6 days before you found my camp, she said after a while. That's a long time to stay on a trail in this. He killed 3 people. I know, but... She paused, choosing. Most men would have turned back after the blizzard. Most men aren't stubborn enough to be stupid about it. She made a sound. Not quite a laugh, but something adjacent. Is that what it was? Stubborn? Probably something less flattering if I'm being honest. What would that be? He thought about it. Thought about the way he'd stood on that ridge at midnight and looked up at the stars and made his peace with dying. And then gotten up and kept walking anyway. There was a name for that, and it wasn't courage, and it wasn't duty, and it wasn't even stubbornness. It was something closer to an inability to stop, a refusal to let the thing win, even when the thing was right, and you were wrong, and the math was perfectly clear. Pride, he said. I didn't want Dutton to think he'd beaten me. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I understand that." The way she said it, not sympathetically, not generously, but with the flat recognition of someone who'd had that exact feeling and recognized it without needing to dress it up, made him look at her. She was wrapping the dressed rabbit in a piece of cloth with careful, economical movements. "You going to tell me what happened 4 years ago?" he said. "It's still morning. It's close to noon." She tied off the cloth and stood up and shouldered her bag. "Ask me tonight," she said, "if you still want to know." He did still want to know, but he picked up his portion of the load and followed her back through the pines toward the hollow, and he didn't ask again until she was ready. She told him that night. Not all of it. He understood there were parts she wasn't ready to give to a man she'd known for 2 days, even a man she'd decided to trust enough to travel with. But enough. She'd worked in Helena, a hotel kitchen, Alderman's Grand, the finest establishment in the territory at the time. The kind of place that attracted senators and railroad men and anyone who wanted to believe they were somewhere civilized. She'd started as a kitchen assistant, washing and peeling and carrying, and within 8 months she'd been running the breakfast service, and within 2 years she'd been producing dishes that guests were asking about by name. Asking who made this. "What's in this? Can I have this again tomorrow?" The head chef's name was Barlow, a man from St. Louis who'd learned his trade in France and never let anyone forget it. He hadn't touched the breakfast menu. That had been considered below him, and so Tessa had been free. And the breakfast menu had become the talk of Helena. And then the owner had brought her to a dinner service, just to observe, just to see. And she'd watched Barlow struggle with a sauce he'd promised and fixed it without being asked, in front of the owner and 3 of his guests. And the sauce had been perfect, and the evening had been saved, and Barlow had never forgiven her for it. He'd started small, taking credit for her ideas in the dining room, reassigning her to tasks that kept her away from guests. When that didn't stop people from asking about her specifically, he'd gone to the owner with a story. Rhett didn't ask what the story was, and she didn't say, but the shape of it was clear in how she described what came next. She'd been called into the owner's office. She'd been told, carefully, and with many regrets, that a woman of her appearance was not suitable for the dining room, that guests had complained, which was a lie so thorough it took her a moment to understand that she was hearing it, and that her continued presence in the hotel kitchen was creating a disruption to the professional environment. She'd been let go with a week's pay and a reference letter so tepid it was essentially worthless. "I tried 2 other places," she said. They were sitting by the fire, and it was late, and the wind had dropped enough that the hollow was almost quiet. Same result. Different stories, same result. She looked into the fire. "So I stopped trying those places, and I came up here, and I've been here since, and I've been fine." "Fine," Rhett said. "Don't! I'm not doing anything. You have a face you're making." He didn't think he was making a face, but he was feeling something that was probably showing up somewhere, and he adjusted his expression as best he could. "I was just," he started, "angry on my behalf. I know. People do that. I appreciate it for about 30 seconds, and then it starts to feel like one more person deciding what I should feel about my own life." He closed his mouth. She looked at him. "That came out sharper than I meant." "No, it didn't." A pause. "No," she admitted. "It didn't. You don't have to apologize for it. I know." She picked up a stick and pushed a log back into the fire. Sparks rose and vanished. "Barlow got what he wanted. I left. But I've had 4 years up here to think about it, and what I've decided is—" She stopped, started again. "I decided that what happened at Alderman's wasn't about me. I was just the thing in the way. The thing Barlow needed removed to protect what was his." She paused. "But that doesn't mean I stop. It means I figure out what I'm working toward and I go toward it. And I do it in a way that doesn't put me at the mercy of people like Barlow again." Rhett looked at her across the fire. "What are you working toward?" She looked back at him for a long moment. "I'm going to have my own place," she said. "A restaurant, my menu, my kitchen, my rules." She said it the way someone states a fact about the future. Not hoping, not wishing, just announcing how it's going to be. "That's why I'm going down to Bozeman. There's a building for sale. I've been saving for 4 years, and I need to see if it's still available." Rhett thought about his savings. about the pay of a deputy U.S. Marshal, which was not substantial, about a woman who'd spent 4 years alone in the Montana highlands cooking extraordinary food for herself and her trap lines, saving every dollar she could against a future she refused to stop believing in. "Bozeman's a good town," he said after a moment. "Growing fast." "I know. I've been watching it from up here." He nodded slowly. He was going to say something. He wasn't sure what. Something about the building, about her plans, about whether she'd looked into the particulars. But he stopped himself because she hadn't asked him for his opinion, and she'd been clear about the kinds of help she was and wasn't interested in. Instead, he said, "Can I ask you one more thing?" She waited. "The stew you made me, the first night, the elk stew with the wild onion and rosehip." He paused. "Did you actually know how good that was? In the moment?" Something happened in her expression that he hadn't seen there before. Not quite a smile. Something warmer and more complicated and somehow more real for not being a full smile. "Yes," she said. "I knew." "Okay," he said. "Good. I wanted to know you knew." She looked at the fire. "Go to sleep, Deputy. We leave before dawn the day after tomorrow." He lay back on his bedroll and looked up at the narrow strip of stars visible above the hollow, and he thought about a woman who'd been reduced to a week's pay and a bad reference letter, and had taken that in 4 years of wilderness and built herself toward something that she could see clear from here. He thought about the elk stew and the way she moved around a camp and the quality of her silence. He thought, Bozeman is going to be very surprised. He was asleep before the fire burned down. They left before first light on the third day, in the narrow window of calm that Tessa had predicted with an accuracy that Rhett found genuinely unnerving. She'd looked at the sky the evening before, and at the snow, and at the direction of the wind, and at something in the bark of the trees that she ran her fingers along without explaining, and she'd said, "Tomorrow morning, 4 hours." And she'd been right to the minute. The pack weight was divided between them, and Rhett carried more than was perhaps wise for a man 4 days out of near death, but he didn't say so, and his legs held, and that was what mattered. Tessa set a pace that was sustainable, and she held it without variation. Not slow, not reckless, just a steady movement through the terrain that covered ground without burning through reserves. She navigated by landmarks he couldn't name. A particular rock formation, a specific angle of approach to a saddle, a place where 2 creeks ran together under the ice in a pattern that told her something about the depth of the snowpack on the slope ahead. She explained things as she went, the same way she'd explained the trapping, not teaching, just thinking out loud. He listened and tried to absorb what he could and accepted that most of it was going to take years to understand properly. 2 hours in, they came to a place where the trail crossed an open slope, and she stopped. He stopped beside her and looked at the slope. It looked passable to him, angled but not dramatically. Snow was deep but not drifted in any obvious way. "No," she said. "What am I looking at?" She pointed. He followed her finger to a line across the upper face of the slope, subtle as a shadow. The snow fractured there in the night. See how the upper section is sitting differently? It's a slab, sitting on a layer of weak snow underneath. You walk that slope, you put weight on that slab, it goes. She paused. "We go around." "How far around?" 40 minutes. He looked at the slope again, trying to see what she saw. He couldn't, not really. He could see a vague line now that she'd pointed it out, but he couldn't have seen it on his own. "You sure?" She gave him a very flat look. "Yes." They went around. It added 40 minutes to the crossing. An hour after they cleared the detour, behind them and above them, they heard a sound like the world tearing, a deep rolling crack followed by a sustained roar that lasted nearly a minute. He looked back and saw a column of snow dust rising above the ridge. "That slope," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. She was already moving again, not making a production of having been right, just moving. "Tessa," he said. "Keep walking, Deputy. We're not to the pass yet." He kept walking, but he looked back once more at the snow dust settling over the ridge, and he thought about the life she'd built in the margins of a world that had tried to take everything from her, and the kind of knowing that came from paying attention when other people had the luxury of not paying attention, and he thought, I am not going to forget what just happened. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do about it, but he wasn't going to forget. The pass came into view an hour later, and beyond it, far below, the beginnings of the lower timber and the country that would carry them, eventually, to the flat valley and the smoke of a growing town. Bozeman. 4 days' walk, if the weather held. Tessa adjusted her pack straps and looked down at the country ahead, without sentiment. Then she looked sideways at him briefly. "You're moving better than yesterday," she said. "I feel better than yesterday." "Good." She started down. "Try to keep up." He did. The 4 days down to Bozeman were not kind, but they were survivable, which by that point was the only standard either of them was applying. The first day was the hardest. The descent from the pass moved through a section of old-growth timber where the snow had compacted into a crust that held your weight for 2 steps, and then collapsed without warning, dropping you thigh-deep into powder, and then held again, and then collapsed again. And after 2 hours of that, your legs were burning and your temper was short, and Rhett had fallen 3 times and stopped counting. Tessa fell once, caught herself on a branch, didn't say anything, and kept going. He noticed she didn't look back to see if he was keeping up. She'd decided he was capable of keeping up, and she was going to hold to that decision until he proved her wrong. He didn't prove her wrong. They made camp the first night in a dense stand of fir where the snow was shallow and the wind stayed off them. Tessa produced dinner from what seemed like nothing: dried elk, some kind of grain she'd packed, water from a creek she'd found by sound before he'd even heard it. They ate without much talking. Not uncomfortable silence. Just 2 people who'd moved hard for 8 hours and had nothing left over for conversation. "Your feet," she said, when they'd finished. "They're fine." "Show me." He wanted to argue. He didn't. He pulled off his boot and she examined the 2 toes that had shown frostbite damage and made a sound that wasn't quite approval, but was at least not alarm. She rewrapped them in dry cloth from her pack, cloth she'd been saving for exactly this kind of thing, and told him to keep them dry and not to favor them so obviously when he walked, because favoring them would throw his gait off and his knees would pay for it by day 3. "You've done this before," he said. "Brought someone down." "Once. A trapper, 2 winters ago." She laced his boot back up with a briskness that made it clear she wasn't inviting the question she knew was coming. "He made it." Rhett left it there. He was learning the geography of what she'd talk about and what she wouldn't, and he was trying to respect it even when curiosity pushed against that. "Thank you," he said, "for the feet. You'd be limping into Bozeman looking like you'd lost an argument with the mountain." "I kind of did." She looked up briefly from tying off the lace. "The mountain didn't win. You're here." He thought about that as he lay back and looked up through the fir branches at the dark sky. The mountain didn't win. Not the thing he'd have said to himself. He'd have said he survived by luck and someone else's skill and a particular combination of stubbornness and stupidity that he should probably not be proud of. But she'd said it differently. The mountain didn't win. Put the agency where it belonged, which was on the person who was still walking. He was starting to understand how her mind worked. He wasn't sure yet how he felt about the fact that he found it so interesting. The second day brought a problem that was different in kind from ice and deep snow. They'd been walking for 3 hours when Tessa stopped at the edge of a tree line and held up her hand. He stopped. She was looking down a long, open slope at a group of men, 4 of them, on horseback, making their way up a trail that would intersect with theirs in about 10 minutes. "You know them?" he said, low. "No." She was watching the way they sat their horses. "They're not from around here. The way they're dressed, they came up from the south." She paused. "They're moving like they're looking for something. Or someone." "Yes." Rhett checked his revolver. His hands were better than they'd been 4 days ago. Not back to full strength, but better. "How do you want to play this?" She looked at him sideways. "Why are you asking me?" "Because you've been right about everything so far, and I don't see a reason to change that now." A brief pause. "We go through the trees, add 20 minutes, come out below them." She turned before he could respond and moved into the timber. They went through the trees. The detour worked. When they came out on the lower trail, the riders were a half-mile above them and moving away. Rhett looked up the slope and watched them go and thought about Cole Dutton, who was somewhere east of here, and about the case file sitting in the Helena office that had his name on it, and about the fact that he was currently walking to Bozeman through the snow because his horse had died and a woman had pulled him back from the edge of freezing to death. Do you think those were Dutton's people? Tessa asked. Maybe. Or they were somebody else's problem entirely. Hard to say. He watched the riders disappear over a rise. Either way, not our problem right now. She nodded. Right now was a phrase she seemed to understand better than most people. The importance of what's in front of you versus the weight of what might be waiting around the next bend. She didn't borrow trouble from tomorrow. He'd noticed that about her. She didn't borrow anything she hadn't actually been given yet. You worried about Bozeman? He asked. They were moving again, and the question came out more directly than he'd intended. She took a few steps before answering. About the building, you mean? About all of it, the building, what comes after. I'm worried about the building being sold already, she said. I've been up on that mountain for 4 months. A lot can happen in 4 months. She kept her eyes on the trail. The rest of it, the after, that's not something I worry about. I know how to work. I know what I can make. If I get the building, I'll figure out the rest. It's not just the building, though, Rhett said. Bozeman's got established places. There are going to be people who don't want a new restaurant in town, especially one run by... He stopped. By a woman who looks like me, she said, not as a question. I was going to say by someone they don't know, but yes, that too. I know that. Her voice was even. I knew that before I started saving. I knew it when I made the decision. She shifted the weight of her pack slightly. Every path I could see had that in it. The option without it didn't exist. So I stopped thinking about it as a reason not to go and started thinking about it as a thing I'd have to deal with when I got there. Rhett walked beside her and didn't say anything for a moment. Most people can't think like that, he finally said. Most people have more options than I did. She said it without bitterness, just the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had spent 4 years getting comfortable with a difficult truth. When you have fewer ways forward, you get better at picking the right one. Yes. The third day, the weather broke wrong. It had been holding, cold but calm, which was all they needed. And then around midday, a front came down off the northern range, and the temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 hours, and the snow started sideways. Not a full blizzard, but close enough to make navigation difficult and exposure a real concern. Tessa adjusted their route without drama, pushing them toward a section of terrain that offered more protection, and they traded speed for shelter and came out even in the end. But by the time she found a spot to camp, Rhett was cold in a way that reminded him too much of the hollow, of that particular leaden heaviness that meant his body was asking questions he didn't want to answer. She built the fire faster than he'd seen anyone build a fire. The wood was wet from the blowing snow, but she had dry tinder in an oilskin pouch in her pack, and she worked from the inside out, starting small and certain and adding to it carefully, and in 12 minutes she had something real going that the wind couldn't knock down. He sat close to it and watched his hands. "Talk to me," she said. He looked up. She was feeding the fire, not looking at him. About what? Anything. You get quiet like that when you're starting to go inside your head too much. It's not good when it's this cold. She fed another piece of wood. So talk. He thought about what to talk about. I grew up in Ohio, he said after a moment. Farming family, 4 brothers. We spent most winters inside, and I always hated it. The smallness of it, everyone in each other's way. I used to think cold weather was just an inconvenience, something you waited out. And now I have a substantially more personal relationship with it. She almost smiled. Where did the martial work come from? Not obvious, farming family in Ohio. The war, he said. It came out flat in the way it always came out when he said it. I was 19, infantry. When it was over, I didn't go back to Ohio. I don't know, it felt too small after everything. I drifted west. Got work as a deputy in a Kansas county because I was the right size and they needed a body, and I didn't have anywhere else to be. He paused. Turned out I was decent at it. Better at it than I'd been at most things. What makes someone decent at it? He thought about it genuinely. Patience, he said, and not having a problem with being uncomfortable for long stretches of time, and caring enough about the job that you don't take shortcuts even when shortcuts are available. He paused. Also, I'm stubborn. I mentioned that. You mentioned it. The fire was going properly now, and she sat back from it and pulled her coat tighter. Were you ever married? The question was direct enough that it surprised him slightly. No, he said. Came close once. She decided she didn't want to be the wife of a man who was gone more than he was home. She was right to decide that. He paused. You? No. Flat and final, the way it wasn't quite the whole answer, but was as much as she was putting on the table tonight. He let it go. The restaurant, he said instead. What do you want it to feel like? The kind of place you're building. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had a different quality. Not softer exactly, but less armored. Like she was talking about something she'd been keeping carefully and was deciding it was all right to let some of it out. I want it to feel like people matter, she said. Not their name, not who their father is, not what they're wearing. I want a miner to be able to sit at the same table as a rancher and eat something that's been made with care. I want the people working in the kitchen to know they're part of something. She paused. I know how that sounds. Once. How do you think it sounds? Naive? Idealistic. She poked at the fire. Like someone who hasn't dealt with enough people yet. I've dealt with a lot of people, Rhett said, and I don't think it sounds naive. I think it sounds like something worth building. She looked at him across the fire, assessing again in that particular way she had. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. Another pause. Then she turned back to the fire. The building is on Gallatin Street, she said. 2 stories. The bottom was a hardware store that closed last spring. Good bones, according to the man who wrote me about it. The brother of a trapper I supplied through one winter who knew I was looking. You've been corresponding with someone in Bozeman? For 8 months. She said it in a tone that made it clear this should not be as surprising as it apparently was to him. I've been planning this for 4 years, Deputy. I don't just show up. He thought about that. 8 months of letters going back and forth between a woman alone in the Montana highlands and a man in a growing frontier town, negotiating the possibility of a future she'd decided she was going to build. The patience of it. The long, careful, cold-eyed patience of it. What's his name? The man with the building? Lester Pruitt. He owns 3 properties on Gallatin. He's been holding it because I asked him to, but 8 months is a long time to hold a commercial property on a promise. Do you have enough? For the purchase? She hesitated, just briefly. Enough for a deposit and first improvements. I'll need to be operating and showing income within 4 months, or I won't have enough to carry the rent through winter. She paused. It's tight. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. She knew the numbers better than anyone, and she wasn't looking for him to reassure her about math. She'd already run 100 times. It'll work, or it won't, she said. But I've been up that mountain long enough. I'm done waiting. They came down into the valley on the 4th afternoon, when the light was going gold and flat across the snow, and the first buildings of Bozeman were visible in the distance as dark shapes against a pale sky. Rhett felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. The low-grade vigilance of 6 days on a trail, and then 4 days coming down through dangerous country, always half-watching, never fully at rest. The valley meant warmth. It meant a bed and a real meal, and a telegraph to Helena to report in. He glanced at Tessa. She was looking at the town with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Intent, maybe. Careful. Not quite nervous, but something adjacent to it. It's still there, he said. I can see that. Building might still be available. I know. They walked in silence for a while, the snow crunching under their boots in a rhythm that had become so familiar over the last 4 days that he thought he'd be hearing it in his sleep for a week. The town grew slowly larger. What are you going to do first? She asked. When we get there. Telegraph, then a bath, then probably sleep for 12 hours. He paused. You? Find Lester Pruitt, she said. No hesitation. Before anything else. Of course. He'd known the answer before he asked. You want company? She looked at him sideways. Not to negotiate, he said quickly. Just in case it goes badly. In case you want someone to walk away with rather than walking away alone. A long pause. They kept walking. You barely know me, she said. I know you saved my life, and I know you can identify an avalanche slab at 200 yards, and I know you make the best elk stew I've ever eaten. That's not nothing. That's not the same as knowing someone. No, he agreed, but it's a start. He looked at the town getting closer. The offer's there if you want it. If you'd rather go alone, I understand. Another stretch of quiet. The wind had gone still, and the cold was settling into its evening version. Heavier, denser, honest. All right, she said, but you don't say anything to Pruitt, not a word. Not one. I handle it. I'm just there to walk away with. She looked at him once more with that assessment that he was getting better at reading. Not suspicion anymore, something more nuanced than that. Deciding how much to trust the thing she was looking at. Fine, she said. They walked into Bozeman just as the last of the light died and the first lamps came on in the windows, and the town looked like something that might be worth fighting for, warm and lit against the dark. Lester Pruitt was a man in his 60s with a careful face and hands that had done real work for most of his life and then stopped, so that they were thick and scarred, but now carried a pen more than anything else. He was still at his office on Main Street when they knocked, or rather when Tessa knocked, and Rhett stood slightly behind her and to the left, close enough to be present, but far enough back to be clearly not the one in charge here. Pruitt opened the door and looked at Tessa, and then looked at Rhett, and then looked back at Tessa. Miss Ashcroft, he said, surprised, but trying not to show it. Mr. Pruitt. She didn't apologize for the hour, or explain her appearance, or do any of the social softening that Rhett had seen women deploy in exactly these situations. I'm here about the Gallatin property. I want to know if it's still available. Pruitt stepped back and let them in. His office was warm and smelled like wood polish and old paper and the particular smell of a man who worked by himself most of the time. He went to his desk and sat down and opened a ledger, and Rhett watched his face and tried to read what was in it before he said anything. It's available, Pruitt said, though I had an inquiry last month from a man named Greer. He runs a supply operation on the east side of town. I told him I was still in conversation with another party. I appreciate that, Tessa said. She sat down across from him without being invited, which Rhett noticed and Pruitt noticed, and nobody said anything about. I have what we discussed, the deposit amount and 6 months of operating capital. Pruitt looked at her. You've been on the mountain this whole winter. Yes. That money came from 4 winters of trapping and supply work, she said. Every dollar is accounted for. I can show you the records if you need them. Pruitt set down his pen. He looked at her with an expression that was complicated enough that Rhett couldn't fully decode it. Not hostile, not condescending, something more like a man confronting a situation he hadn't expected to actually happen and was now having to decide what he actually thought about it. The building needs work, he said. The roof was repaired last fall, but the interior needs to be rebuilt for a kitchen operation. The city is going to want a fire inspection before you can open. I know what it needs, Tessa said. I have plans drawn up. He stopped. You have plans. I've had 4 months, she said, with the patience of someone explaining something for what would not be the first or last time. I drew them to scale. I know what I need to do and in what order and roughly what it'll cost. She reached into her coat and produced a folded sheaf of papers, which she set on the desk in front of him. You can look at them if you want. Pruitt looked at the papers. He looked at Tessa. He unfolded the papers slowly, and his expression as he looked at them shifted, from the complicated thing it had been to something simpler, which was just a man looking at something he hadn't been expecting and registering, slowly, that it was good. Rhett stayed where he was and said nothing, which was exactly what he'd promised. These are very complete, Pruitt said finally. Yes, the kitchen design, he pointed to something. This is based on a professional layout. I worked in a professional kitchen for 3 years, Tessa said. I know what a kitchen needs to function. Pruitt set the papers down. He looked at her one more time with that complicated expression, and then he seemed to make a decision. Not a reluctant one, but not an entirely simple one either. He held out his hand across the desk. We have a deal, Miss Ashcroft. Tessa shook it, firmly, without ceremony. When can I have the keys? Tomorrow morning. She stood. Rhett stood. She was almost at the door when Pruitt said, Miss Ashcroft. She stopped but didn't turn. I want you to know, when Greer inquired last month, the price he offered was 20% higher than what we agreed. She turned then, looked at him. I told him I was still in conversation, Pruitt said. I want you to know that. A pause. Something moved across Tessa's face that Rhett would spend a long time thinking about afterward. Not gratitude, exactly. Or not just that. Something about being seen, maybe. About someone deciding to do the decent thing when the decent thing costs something. "I know," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt." They walked out into the cold Bozeman night, and Rhett kept his mouth shut all the way down the block and across Main Street and halfway toward the hotel he'd identified before she finally stopped walking and stood there on the boardwalk with her pack on her shoulders and looked up at the dark sky. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. "That's a good sign," he said. "Pruitt." "One good sign," she said. "There'll be plenty of bad ones to follow." "Probably." He looked down the street in the direction of Gallatin. "But you've got the building." She looked in the same direction. Her face in the lamplight was tired and complicated, and something else. Something that wasn't quite hope, because hope was too soft a word for it, but was the thing that lived right next to hope in people who'd been disappointed enough times that they couldn't afford to be careless with it. "I've got the building," she said. They stood there on the boardwalk in the cold for a few more seconds, long enough that it became a moment rather than just a pause. And Rhett thought about 6 days on a trail and 4 days coming down through the snow and a hollow in the mountains where a woman had pointed a rifle at his chest and then given him broth and saved his life without making a single speech about it. He thought, whatever happens in this town, I want to see how this ends. And then Tessa Ashcroft hitched her pack higher on her shoulders and turned away from the lamplight toward the dark end of the street, and he followed, because that seemed like the right thing to do. The keys to the Gallatin Street building were cold in Tessa's hand when Pruitt handed them over the next morning, and they stayed cold all the way down the block because she walked the whole distance without putting them in her pocket. Just held them. Rhett noticed but didn't say anything about it. The building was worse than the letters had suggested. That was the first honest thing Pruitt said when he met them there. Not apologizing, just stating it, which Tessa seemed to appreciate more than apology would have gotten him. The roof repair from the previous fall had been done adequately but not well, which were two different things, and 2 of the interior walls needed to come out entirely for the kitchen footprint she'd designed. The floor in the back half was soft in places that meant the subfloor had water damage. The front windows were original and single pane and would lose heat like a sieve through a Montana winter. Tessa walked through it all without her face doing much of anything. She knocked on walls. She tested the floor with her boot heel, found the soft places, mapped them in her head. She stood in the center of what would eventually be the kitchen and turned in a slow circle, looking up at the ceiling, measuring things with her eyes that Rhett couldn't follow. "Well?" he said when she'd completed the circle. "It's fixable," she said. "That's all?" "That's enough." She folded her plans back up and put them in her coat. "I need a carpenter. And a roofer who won't overcharge me because I'm a woman, asking the question." She looked at him. "Any chance you know someone?" He'd been in Bozeman exactly 14 hours, most of which he'd spent sleeping. "I'll ask around," he said. That was how it started. Rhett asking around, Tessa making decisions, the 2 of them moving through a town that was growing fast enough that half the people in it were still figuring out who they were and what they were building and what the rules were going to be. That kind of town had advantages. It also had the particular danger of men who'd decided the rules were whatever they said they were until someone stopped them. Rhett reported to the local marshal's office that first morning. A deputy named Harlan Cobb ran the town office, while the senior marshal covered the wider territory. And Cobb was a solid enough man who'd heard of Rhett from the Helena reports and took him seriously, which helped. He filed the report on Dutton, updated the wanted notices, and spent 2 hours going over what he knew about Dutton's likely direction. Cobb had nothing from the Judith Basin yet. The trail was cold. There was nothing to do but wait for a wire and keep working. He didn't tell Cobb about Tessa. Not because he was hiding it, there was nothing to hide, but because it wasn't Cobb's business, and Tessa hadn't asked to be anyone's business but her own. She had the carpenter inside a week, the roofer in 10 days. She worked alongside both of them herself, which startled the carpenter. A quiet Finnish man named Arne Michaela, who'd been in the territory for 12 years and who, Rhett noticed, adjusted quickly once he understood that Tessa's instructions were specific, technically grounded, and not going to change because he raised an eyebrow at them. Rhett helped when he could, which was evenings and whatever hours Cobb didn't need him. He was not a skilled carpenter, which Tessa pointed out once and didn't belabor. He was, however, capable of moving things, holding things, and doing the physical work that was just physical work and didn't require expertise. He did it without requiring praise for it, which seemed to matter to her. "You don't have to do this," she said one evening when they were pulling up soft floorboards in the back and the work was dirty and going slowly. "I know. You have a job." "I have a job that ends at 6. It's 7. He pried up another board. "Also, you're not paying the carpenter enough." "I'm paying him market rate. He's working 12-hour days. So am I." He looked at her. She was prying up a board from the other end, her hair tied back and her coat off despite the cold, a smear of old paint across her left cheekbone that she hadn't noticed. "That's not an argument," he said. "It's an observation. I notice what people give and I remember it." She set the board aside. "Michaela knows that." "Do I know that?" She glanced up briefly. "You're learning." He went back to the floor. Outside, Bozeman was doing its evening business. Horses and boots on the boardwalk, voices from the saloon 2 blocks north, the distant sound of a hammer from some other building project on some other street. The town was always building something. That was the thing about it. There was an energy to the place that felt less like stability and more like acceleration, like something was happening here and had been happening and wasn't done yet. He thought about Cold Dutton, somewhere in the Judith Basin, getting further away every day. He thought about the report on his desk and the wire that hadn't come and the case that was technically still open. He was not a man who left things unfinished, but he was also, for the first time in several years, a man who was in a place he didn't want to leave. He hadn't fully accounted for that yet. The Alderman Hotel sat on the east end of Main Street and was the finest establishment in Bozeman by the assessment of everyone who used the word finest in the way that meant expensive and exclusionary rather than actually good. It was run by a man named Douglas Hale, who had come west from Chicago with money and the particular confidence of a man who'd never had to question whether his confidence was warranted. Hale had been in Bozeman for 3 years and had made himself essential to the social architecture of the town in the way that men with money and no competition tended to do. He came to see Tessa on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after she'd gotten the keys. Rhett wasn't there when it happened, but Michaela told him about it that evening, in the careful way of a man reporting something he found troubling but wasn't sure it was his place to characterize. Hale had come into the building with 2 other men, associates, Michaela said, though he used the word carefully, the way you use a word when you mean something more specific but can't prove it, and had looked around the space in progress and told Tessa that it was a brave undertaking and that he admired the ambition, and then had offered to buy the building from her at a price that was, Michaela said, notably below what she'd paid Pruitt for it. "What did she say?" Rhett asked. Michaela thought about how to put it. She said no. Just no? She said no, and she said it in a way that made the conversation clearly finished. How did Hale take that? He smiled, Michaela said. That was the part that bothered me. He smiled like she'd said something he found amusing. And then he said something like, "Boy, well, if things get difficult, the offer stands." And then he left. Rhett was quiet for a moment. "When things get difficult," he said. "Not if." That's what he said. Rhett told Tessa about it that evening. He told her what Michaela had said, and he kept his voice flat and informational, and didn't editorialize, because she'd asked him not to editorialize about things that hadn't happened yet. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "I know who Douglas Hale is. You've met him before? I know his type before. I know how they operate." She was looking at the half-finished kitchen wall, assessing a joint where 2 boards met. They wait. They look for pressure points. If the roof needs another repair, if a supplier won't do business with you, if the city inspector has questions that take longer than they should to resolve. She pressed the joint with her thumb. "This needs another nail." "Tessa." "I know, Rhett." She turned and looked at him, and her expression was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work and everything to do with the weight of knowing exactly what was coming and not being able to stop the knowing. "I've been dealing with Douglas Hale in one form or another since I was 19 years old. Barlow was a Hale. The owner of Alderman's in Helena was a Hale. They all have the same smile." She picked up a hammer. I'll deal with it when it becomes something to deal with. Right now I have a kitchen to finish. He watched her drive the nail. One clean stroke, then a second to set it. No wasted motion. All right, he said. What do you need me to do? Hold that board flat while I nail the other end. He held the board flat. She nailed the other end. 6 weeks after Tessa got her keys, she had a kitchen. It wasn't finished. There were still things to do to the front room, and the sign wasn't made yet, and she hadn't settled on every detail of the menu. But the kitchen worked. The stove was in and drawing properly. The prep surfaces were solid and level. The storage was organized in a way that reflected the logic of someone who'd spent years making do with less and knew exactly what mattered and what didn't. She cooked in it for the first time on a cold February evening when Rhett and Michaela were the only ones there, and what she produced from a limited set of ingredients and a stove she was still learning was so far beyond what either of them expected that Michaela actually put down his fork and looked at it. You need to open this place, Michaela said. I know that, Tessa said. I mean soon. I know that too. Rhett said nothing. He was eating, and he was thinking, and he was watching Tessa watch Michaela eat. Watching the way she tracked what the food was doing to the person eating it. Not vanity, something more functional than that. She was calibrating. She was reading the result and filing it and deciding what to adjust. She never stopped working, even when she was sitting still. The Alderman Hotel had a dining room that seated 40 and served a menu that Douglas Hale had imported a cook from Denver to produce. It was expensive and consistent and utterly without surprise. The railroad men ate there, and the land agents, and the lawyers who'd followed the railroad men, and the businessmen who'd followed the lawyers. They ate there because it was the only place worth eating in Bozeman, and because being seen there meant something in the social hierarchy of the town, and for no other reason. It was not going to be difficult to be better than the alderman's dining room. What was going to be difficult was getting people to accept that something better existed. In the first week of March, Hale's cook, the man from Denver, came to Tessa. His name was Warren Price, and he was 24 years old and had been cooking professionally since he was 16 and had been living in Bozeman for 2 years and had been quietly miserable about it for most of that time. He came on a Tuesday morning when the front room was still half finished and Tessa was doing inventory of her dry goods, and he knocked on the open door frame and stood there looking like a man who'd rehearsed what he wanted to say and had just forgotten all of it. You're Tessa Ashcroft, he said. I am. They say you worked at the Alderman's in Helena. I did. He shifted his weight. He was tall and thin and had the particular nervous energy of someone who cared deeply about their work and had been in an environment that didn't care back. I heard about what happened there, what Barlow did. She looked at him steadily. Who told you? Someone who used to work there. They said you were the best cook in that kitchen and that Barlow had you removed because he was afraid of it. He paused. I'm the cook at the Alderman here. I've been here 2 years. I know. I want to know if you're hiring. Tessa set down her inventory list. She looked at him properly. The same assessment she'd given Rhett on a frozen ridge, reading the person in front of her for what was actually there rather than what was presented. Why? She said. Because Hale tells me what to put on the menu, and it's not... He stopped, started again. It's not what I do. It's not what the food should be. It's safe and expensive, and nobody ever says anything about it other than that it's fine. He said the word fine with a very specific kind of pain. And I heard about what you did up on the mountain was 4 years, cooking from whatever you could find. And I want to work somewhere that cares about that, about the actual food. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Rhett was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, having come out to see who was at the door, and he watched her think it through. Not making it easy, not making it hard, just thinking it through properly. If I hire you, Hale will make it difficult, she said. I know that. He'll assume you're feeding him information. He might come after you directly. I know. I don't pay Denver wages. I don't need Denver wages. She looked at him for another long moment. Come back Thursday, she said. Bring something you'd put on your own menu if nobody was telling you what to do. Bring ingredients and cook it here. I want to see how you work. He nodded, quickly, like he was afraid she'd change her mind if he moved too slowly. Thursday, he said. Yes. Thank you. He left. Tessa picked her inventory list back up. That's going to antagonize Hale, Rhett said. Probably. She made a note on the list. He's good? From what I've eaten at the Alderman, he's better than what they're letting him be. That's what I thought. She turned a page. Thursday will tell me for certain. Warren Price came on a Thursday and cooked a braised short rib with a reduction that smelled like it had been planned out carefully and executed without hesitation, and a potato preparation that was so simple and so right that Tessa stood looking at it for a moment before she tasted it. She asked him questions while he cooked, not testing him, listening to him think, hearing how he talked about what he was making and why. He talked about food the way she did, like it was worth talking about seriously. She hired him at the end of the afternoon. 2 days later, Hale came back. This time he didn't bring associates. He came alone, in the middle of the afternoon when Rhett was at the marshal's office and Michaela had gone to get lumber. He found Tessa alone in the kitchen running through prep work, and he came through the front room without knocking on anything and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Warren Price," he said. Tessa didn't stop what she was doing. "Mr. Hale?" "He came to work for you." "He did." Hale leaned against the doorframe with the ease of a man in a room he considers his own, even when it isn't. "He's under contract," he said. 90 days' notice." "He gave you 90 days' notice." "I'm aware." Tessa moved a pot off the high flame to a lower one. "He doesn't start here until May." Haley smiled. The same smile Michaela had described. The one that said he found her amusing, which was the most condescending possible reaction, and he knew it. "You're going to have a hard time here," he said. "I want you to understand that, not as a threat, just as a fact." She turned around and looked at him. "What kind of fact?" "Bozeman has an established order. People who've been here and built things have relationships with suppliers, with city officials, with the men who decide what this town is going to look like in 5 years. Someone coming in and setting up shop outside of that order makes things complicated." "Does it?" "Suppliers sometimes have difficulty making deliveries to certain addresses. City inspections can be thorough and time-consuming. Newspapers write about places when they're doing well and also when there are questions about quality or management." He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "I don't control any of that. I'm just describing how things work." Tessa looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the low sound of the simmer on the stove. "Are you finished?" she said. Hale blinked. It was very brief, but he blinked. "Because I have prep work to do," she said. "And everything you just described, suppliers, inspections, newspapers. I've been planning for those problems since before I came down from that mountain. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew people like you would be part of this no matter where I went." She turned back to the stove. "So I'm not afraid of what you're describing, Mr. Hale. I'm just bored by it." The silence that followed had weight. Rhett, who had come in the back while Hale was talking and had positioned himself just inside the kitchen where Hale couldn't see him, watched Hale's face process what had just happened to him. The smile was gone. What replaced it wasn't quite anger. More the look of a man who'd expected a particular conversation and had gotten a fundamentally different one and hadn't caught up yet. "You're making a mistake," Hale said finally. "Maybe," Tessa said. "But it'll be mine." Hale left. His footsteps on the new floor were unhurried and deliberate, the footsteps of a man performing composure, and then the front door opened and closed. Rhett came fully into the kitchen. Tessa didn't turn around. "How long were you standing there?" she said. "Long enough." "I handled it." "I know you did." She was quiet for a moment, her hands resting on the edge of the prep surface. Just a beat. 10 seconds, maybe, where the thing she wasn't showing anywhere else showed in the set of her shoulders. Then she straightened and picked up her knife. "He's going to make it harder now," she said. "Yes." "Suppliers first, probably. He's got relationships with the 2 main ones in town. I know a man in Livingston who runs a supply operation independent of the Bozeman network," Rhett said. "Honest, fair prices, reliable delivery. I can write him." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You know a man in Livingston? I've worked this territory for 4 years. I know a lot of people." He paused. "I'll write him tonight." She turned back to her prep. "Thank you," she said. The way she said it was different from the way she'd said it for the broth on the mountain. Less from the edge of need, more from a place of choosing to mean it. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "The city fire inspection. Cobb's been helpful, but the fire marshal's office is under a man named Sutter, And Sutter and Hale are old enough acquaintances that I wouldn't count on that inspection moving quickly. He paused. I can't interfere with it officially, but I can make sure the paperwork is submitted correctly, and I can be present when the inspector comes. And there's a certain kind of inspector who does his job better when he knows a marshal is watching him do it. Tessa set down her knife and turned fully around. She looked at him with an expression that he was still, after all these weeks, not entirely able to decode. It had too many things in it at once, and she was too practiced at not letting any single thing become legible. "Rhett," she said. "Yeah." "Why are you doing all this?" He'd thought about how to answer this because he'd known she was going to ask it eventually, and he'd wanted to have a clear answer. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer included things like, because you pulled me out of a snowbank and didn't ask for anything in return, and because the thing you're building is worth building and watching somebody try to ruin it. Purely out of selfishness makes something in me go very quiet and cold. And because, this part he was least prepared to say, I've spent most of my adult life moving from place to place following a trail, and I'm trying to figure out what it means that this is the first place I've stopped moving and looked around and thought, here, this is where something matters. He didn't say any of that. He said, because it's the right thing to do. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned back to the counter and picked up her knife. All right, she said. Then write your man in Livingston. The inspection came on a cold March morning and lasted 4 hours, which was 3 hours longer than it should have. The inspector's name was Fielding, not Sutter himself, a younger man sent in Sutter's place, and he found 14 items to flag, several of which were so minor that Rhett, standing in the front room with his badge visible and his expression professionally neutral, could see the man generating them in real time rather than finding them. He didn't say anything until item 11, which was a question about the flue certification on the kitchen stove that was not a legitimate inspection requirement under any code Rhett had ever seen applied in any town in the territory. Fielding, he said. Fielding stopped writing. I'm going to need you to show me where that requirement appears in the city's fire code. A pause. It's because I looked at the code last night. I didn't see it. Rhett's voice was even. If it's there, show me, and Miss Ashcroft will address it. If it's not there, I'd like you to take it off the list. Fielding looked at him. He looked at his list. He crossed out item 11. Items 12, 13, and 14 also disappeared. 11 legitimate items remained, and Tessa addressed each of them within a week, and the certification came through at the end of March. She posted it on the wall of the kitchen without ceremony, in the same place she'd planned from the beginning, between the supply list and the prep schedule she'd been refining for months. She was going to open. Hale could see it happening and couldn't stop it. And the look on his face when he passed the building on Main Street, Rhett saw at once through the front window, Hale pausing on the boardwalk across the street and looking at the building where lights were on late and there was always someone working, was the look of a man recalculating. There was just one thing that was going wrong, and it had been going wrong for 3 weeks before Rhett noticed it. He noticed it because of the mornings. He'd taken to coming by early before the marshal's office opened, and for the first weeks Tessa had been there already, always, moving through the kitchen with her characteristic certainty. But lately she was getting there later, and once he was there and she arrived, he noticed things. The way she sat down when she didn't need to, the particular quality of her silence that was different from her usual silence, her hands sometimes resting on the prep surface as if she needed it to hold her up. You're not sleeping, he said, on an April morning when she arrived 40 minutes late and set down her bag with a heaviness that wasn't just tired. I'm sleeping enough. Tessa. She looked at him. Her eyes were not right. There were shadows under them that had been accumulating for weeks and had gotten to the point where they were undeniable. I'm fine, she said. You've said that before when you weren't. I'm managing, she said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it. There's a lot to manage. Talk to me about it. She was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a stool and sat down heavily. The Livingston supplier is good. The kitchen is ready. The menu is set. She paused. The front room staff, I have 2 women I want to hire, both good, both experienced. Hale has spoken to both of their current employers. Not explicitly, not anything you could confront him about directly. Just conversations. Questions about their reliability, their suitability. Her voice was controlled, One of them told me yesterday she couldn't take the job. She has a family. She can't risk Hale making things difficult for her husband's work. Rhett sat down across from her. And the money, she said. It's tighter than I planned. The inspection delays cost me 6 weeks of revenue I'd budgeted for. I can open in 3 weeks and be all right, or I can open in 6 weeks and be in trouble. She looked at the table. 3 weeks might not be enough time. He looked at her. He looked at the kitchen behind her, the stove she'd fought for, the prep surfaces that were right, the layout she'd designed on that mountain and carried down through the snow in her coat. He looked at the woman who'd given him broth and stood on a frozen ridge and walked 4 days through the highlands and shaken Pruitt's hand without softening any of it, and who was sitting here in April looking like the weight was finally, genuinely getting to her. He'd been thinking about something for 3 weeks. He'd been thinking about it carefully, the way he thought about things that mattered, not impulsively, not dramatically, but steadily from all angles until he was sure. I have $4,000, he said, in an account in Helena, savings from 7 years of martial work. He paused. I want to put it in. Tessa looked up. No. As a partner, not a loan. A proper stake. I put in capital. I have a share of what you build. He kept his voice level. You keep control of the kitchen, the menu, every decision that matters. I handle the things you don't have time to handle. The supplier relationships, the city paperwork, the situations where a badge in the room changes how people behave. Rhett, you're not going to do this alone. You've been trying to do it alone because that's what you've always had to do. But you don't have to right now, and there's no principle being served by refusing help that's offered honestly. She stared at him. Her expression was complicated enough that he gave her time with it. You're a deputy marshal, she said finally. I'm a deputy marshal who hasn't gotten a wire about Dutton in 8 weeks, and who was told last week that the Judith Basin office has picked up the trail and doesn't need the Helena involvement anymore. He paused. That case is over for me, Tessa, and I've been thinking for 3 weeks about what comes next. You'd leave the marshal service? I'd leave this posting, I'd keep the badge. Cobb says there's room for a second deputy in Bozeman, and the territory office would approve it, but the work here is different. Less tracking, more town work, more of this. He gestured at the building around them. Making sure things like this inspection don't happen again. Making sure Hale understands that some things are not for sale. She was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the April morning was doing its slow work of becoming a day. You'd do all that, she said, for a restaurant. He looked at her steadily. I'd do all that, he said, for the right thing. Tessa Ashcroft, who did not cry and had not cried in front of anyone in longer than she could clearly remember, pressed her lips together and looked at the wall. Her jaw worked once. Then she looked back at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was contained and deliberate and real. Partners, she said. Partners, he said. She held out her hand. He shook it. It was not a dramatic moment. Her grip was firm and brief, and then she pulled her hand back and stood up and said, We open in 3 weeks. We have a lot to do. Tell me where to start, he said. She was already moving toward the kitchen. The front room, she said. The left wall is still wrong, and Michaela needs to fix it today. He followed her. That was the right thing to do. He was starting to understand that following Tessa Ashcroft was almost always the right thing to do, and he was starting to stop being surprised by it. The sign went up on a Tuesday, 3 days before they opened. Michaela built it from a single plank of Douglas fir that he'd been holding back since February, knowing without being told that this particular piece of wood was for something that mattered. He carved the letters himself, working evenings in the back of the building, while Tessa ran prep and Warren moved through the kitchen with the focused quiet of a man who'd been given room to work and wasn't going to waste it. The hearth table. Simple, readable, no ornamentation. The kind of sign that said what it was without asking you to be impressed by it. Rhett was the one who went up the ladder to hang it. Tessa stood on the boardwalk below and directed, left, a fraction more, stop, until it was level, and then she stood looking at it for a moment with her arms crossed and her chin up, and an expression on her face that Rhett, coming down the ladder, caught only the tail end of before she replaced it with something more businesslike. Good, she said. That's all? Michaela said. That's what I said. But she looked at it once more before she went back inside, and Rhett noticed. The 3 days before opening were the closest he'd seen her come to overwhelmed. Not in a way she showed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't snap at anyone, didn't make decisions she later regretted. But she stopped sleeping more than 4 hours, and she forgot to eat twice, which Rhett only discovered because Warren mentioned it quietly, and with the particular concern of someone who understood that a cook not eating was a specific kind of wrong. Rhett started putting food in front of her and not leaving until she ate it, which she tolerated with the grace of someone who knew she was being managed and had decided it was justified. "You should rest," he told her, the night before opening, when it was past midnight and she was still at the prep table going through the next day's sequence for the 4th time. "I'll rest after tomorrow. You've said that every night this week. Tomorrow I'll mean it." She looked up from the sequence. "The reservation list? Did Cobb confirm he's coming?" "He confirmed. He's bringing his wife and the 2 deputies from the East office. That's 8 covers just from the marshal's office. Good." She made a note. "The Pruitt table, 7 o'clock, confirmed. And the Callaway Ranch, 4 people, 6:30. He sat down across from her. "Tessa, every reservation is confirmed. Warren knows the menu. Clara and Ruth know their tables. Michaela fixed the left wall and the floor doesn't creak anymore, and the stove has been running perfectly for 3 weeks. He paused. "Everything that can be ready is ready." She looked at him. Her eyes were tired but precise. "What if it's not enough? Not enough how? Not enough to matter. People come once because it's new, because they're curious. That's not a restaurant, that's an event." She set her pencil down. "I need them to come back. They'll come back because the food is extraordinary. You're not objective. Warren's objective. Ask Warren." She was quiet. Outside, Bozeman had gone mostly to sleep, just the distant sound of the saloon at the far end of the street doing its late business. The dining room of the hearth table was dark except for one lamp, and the tables were set and waiting with a care that Rhett had watched Ruth spend 2 hours on. The cloths pressed, the silverware arranged, nothing fancy but everything considered. "I've been working toward this for 4 years, Tessa said. "I know what I'm capable of. I know what Warren can do. I know the menu is right." She was talking half to him and half to herself, thinking out loud in the way she rarely permitted herself. "But knowing all of that doesn't make the gap between what I intend and what actually happens any smaller. That gap is always there. It's always possible to do everything right and still have it go wrong." "Yes," Rhett said. He didn't try to argue with that because it was true, and she'd know he knew it was true. That's always possible. "So how do you carry that?" He thought about it. He thought about 6 days on a trail in the Montana winter, and about the particular moment on the ridge when he'd understood he was probably going to die and had gotten up and kept walking anyway. "You just carry it," he said. "You don't put it down because you can't. So you carry it, and you keep moving, and you find out later which way it went." She looked at him for a moment, then she picked up her pencil. "Go home," she said. "You need sleep too." "I'll go when you go." A pause. "Rhett." "I'll go when you go," he said again, simply. She looked at him with that expression, the one with too many things in it, and then she put the pencil down and stood up. "Fine," she said. "We go." Opening day was a Friday in late April, and the weather, which had been threatening all week, held just long enough. The first reservation arrived 7 minutes early. A railroad surveyor named Aldous Crane and his business partner, 2 men who'd been eating at the Alderman for 2 years, and had come to the hearth table because someone at the land office had mentioned it, and they were the kind of men who investigated new things without waiting to be told the new thing was acceptable. They sat down and looked around the dining room with the assessing eyes of men who'd been in a lot of rooms. Rhett showed them to their table. He was not a natural front-of-house man. He knew that about himself. But he was steady and he was direct, and he could read a room, which turned out to be most of what was needed. Clara and Ruth handled the actual service. He was there to be visible, to manage the door, to handle anything that required a different kind of presence. The food started coming out of the kitchen 40 minutes in, and the dining room, which had filled to 3/4 by then, went through a particular kind of change. Not immediately, not dramatically, more like a slow shift in the quality of attention in the room. Conversations that had been happening at a normal social pace slowed down slightly. Forks paused. Forks. People looked at their plates with a focus that was different from the polite attention people gave to food they'd been told was supposed to be good. Crane, the railroad surveyor, said something to his partner. Rhett was too far away to hear it, but he saw the partner nod. Not the polite nod of agreement, the slower nod of a man being corrected about something he thought he already understood. He went back to the kitchen to tell Tessa. She was in the middle of 3 things simultaneously and didn't look up. "How's the room?" "They're eating," he said. "Really eating. Anyone send anything back?" "No." "Table 6, the elk?" "Finished it. Didn't leave anything." She moved a pan. "Tell Ruth that table 4 needs water." He told Ruth. He went back to managing the door. 2 more parties arrived, both without reservations, and he seated them at the remaining tables and came back to find Clara telling him that Crane had asked to speak with the cook. Tessa came out of the kitchen with her apron still on and her hair slightly disordered from the heat and stood at Crane's table with the posture of someone who was not going to apologize for how she looked. Crane stood up, which surprised her. He was a man of 60 and she was a woman of 26, and he stood up. "I've eaten in Chicago," he said. "I've eaten in St. Louis. I've eaten in San Francisco." He paused. "That elk preparation is the best thing I've eaten in 10 years. Tessa looked at him. "Thank you," she said. No deflection, no false modesty, just thank you. "What's your name?" "Tessa Ashcroft." "I'm going to tell every man I know to come here," he said. "I want you to know that." She nodded once. "I appreciate it." She went back to the kitchen. Rhett, watching from the door, saw her pause just inside the kitchen entrance, just for a second, just long enough to take one breath, and then she was back at the stove. Crane kept his word. The following week was different from the first, busier, louder, less predictable. The word that had started with railroad men spread to ranchers and mining interests, and the network of businessmen who moved between Bozeman and Livingston and Helena following money and opportunity. The reservation book filled 3 days out, and then 4, and then a week. Hale's response was not subtle and not slow. The first thing was the newspaper. The Bozeman Courier ran a small piece in its 3rd week, not about the hearth table specifically, but about concerns some community members had raised regarding the standards of food preparation in newly opened establishments, with a brief mention of an establishment on Gallatin Street that had yet to be reviewed by independent observers. It was written carefully enough that there was nothing to confront directly. But the implication was clear, and it was planted, and people read it. Tessa read it on a Thursday morning and set the paper down and went into the kitchen and didn't mention it. Rhett mentioned it to Cobb, who shrugged in the way of a man who'd seen this kind of thing before and found it distasteful but not actionable. "Hale has a relationship with the Courier," Cobb said. "Has for 2 years. Not much to do about it." "Can the marshal's office issue any kind of statement about a restaurant review?" "No." Cobb leaned back in his chair. "Rhett, the man is being unpleasant. He's not breaking any law." "Not yet." Cobb gave him a look. "Not yet," he agreed. The second thing was the suppliers. The Livingston man, whose name was Garrett and who'd been reliable for 3 months, sent a letter in the 5th week saying he'd received a better contract offer from a Bozeman operation and couldn't continue supplying the hearth table at the agreed rates. He was apologetic. He was specific about the numbers, which told Rhett that the offer Hale had made him was substantial, enough to be a real business decision, not just pressure. Garrett wasn't a villain. He was a man with a business making a business decision. Tessa read that letter twice. Then she put it in a drawer and said, "Who's next?" Rhett had spent a week already building contingencies for exactly this. He had 2 names, a ranch supply operation north of town that sold provisions on the side, and a contact in Livingston who was independent of Garrett and smaller but reliable. Neither was perfect. Together they covered most of what Garrett had supplied. "It'll cost more," he said. "How much more?" 12%? Maybe 15%. She was quiet, running the math. "We can absorb it if the volumes hold." She paused. "The volumes have to hold." "They'll hold," he said. "Crane brought 4 more parties last week. The ranch trade is starting to come in. We're not in trouble yet." "Not yet," she said. The same thing Cobb had said for a different reason. What they didn't account for, what Rhett should have anticipated and didn't, and would think about later as the thing he'd gotten wrong, was Warren. It started subtly. Warren came in one morning looking like he hadn't slept, and when Tessa asked him about a new preparation he'd been developing, he was short with her in a way that wasn't like him. She let it go. Then there was a morning he arrived 20 minutes late, which had never happened, and offered no explanation that covered it adequately. Then Ruth came to Rhett privately and said she'd heard from her husband that someone had been asking questions around town about Warren's background, about his family, about where he'd worked before Denver, about things that had nothing to do with cooking. Rhett went to Warren that afternoon and closed the kitchen door. "Talk to me," he said. Warren was cleaning down the prep surface with the focused intensity of someone who needed something to do with his hands. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. What happened?" A long pause. "Someone came to my boarding house 2 nights ago, after dark. I don't know who sent him." He kept cleaning. "He said there were stories going around about why I left Denver. He said the stories were going to get worse if I stayed at this job." Rhett was very still. "What stories?" "Nothing true." Warren's voice was tight. "I left Denver because I wanted to, because I had an opportunity here, and because Denver wasn't—" He stopped. "There's nothing true to tell. But that doesn't matter, does it? If someone decides to tell a story about you, the truth isn't really the point." "No," Rhett said. "It's not." He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Warren, look at me." Warren looked at him. "I need you to tell me everything the man said, every specific thing, because if Hale is sending people to boarding houses after dark to intimidate my employees, that crosses a line that I can actually do something about," Warren told him. It took 20 minutes, and some of it was clearly painful, and Rhett listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Warren was done, Rhett sat with it for a moment. "You're not leaving," Rhett said. It wasn't a question. Warren looked at him carefully. "I don't want to leave." "Good. Because you're not." He stood up. "I need to write something down while the details are fresh. I'll be back." He wrote everything down. He took it to Cobb, and Cobb's expression went through several stages while he read it and ended somewhere serious. "If this man can be identified," Cobb started. "I'm going to identify him," Rhett said. "I need a day." It took him 2 days, not one. The man's name was Briggs, not a local, brought in from somewhere south, the kind of man who did this kind of work for money and didn't ask too many questions about it. Rhett found him at one of the North End saloons on a Thursday afternoon, and the conversation was brief and not entirely civilized, and at the end of it, Briggs was on a horse headed south with a clear understanding of what would happen if he came back. He couldn't prove the connection to Hale, not legally, not in a way that Cobb could act on officially. Hale had kept enough distance that there was nothing documentable except the shape of it, which was unmistakable but not actionable. Tessa, when Rhett told her, was quiet for a long time. "Warren knows?" she said. "Warren knows the man is gone." "Did you tell him about Hale?" "Not explicitly. He figured it out." She nodded. Then, "Is he all right?" "He's angry," Rhett said, "which is healthier than scared." "Good." She was standing at the kitchen window that looked out on the small alley behind Gallatin Street, and she was looking at something that wasn't quite there. "This is going to keep going," she said. "Hale isn't going to stop." "No. He's going to find the next thing. And the next." "Probably." She turned from the window. Her expression had the quality he'd learned to recognize. Not resignation, not defeat, but the flat, clear-eyed recognition of a problem as it actually was, rather than how you'd prefer it to be. "Then we have to make the restaurant strong enough that none of the individual things he does are enough," she said. "We can't stop him from trying. We can only make sure that what we're building is too solid to knock down." Rhett looked at her. "What does that look like, practically?" "It looks like we grow faster than he can interfere." She came away from the window. "We expand the evening service. We start a lunch service. Limited menu, faster, more covers. We build relationships with every ranch and mine and business within 30 miles so our supply network is distributed enough that losing one source doesn't hurt us." She paused. "And we hire." "Hire who?" "Young people who need work. People who can cook, who want to learn, who don't have other options." She was moving now, back toward the kitchen proper, her mind already running ahead of her feet. "If we become the place where people get their start, if we're known for that, Then every person we train becomes someone who has a reason to want us to succeed. Rhett followed her. That's going to stretch the finances. Yes. She picked up her apron from the hook. Everything worth doing stretches the finances. I know. I just want to be sure we're both looking at the same numbers. I've been looking at the numbers since the mountain. She tied the apron. We can do it. It's tight, but we can do it. She looked at him. Are you in? I've been in since February. I'm still in. Still, something moved in her expression. She turned to the stove. Then go find me a lunch service menu. Talk to Warren. Something simple, 8 to 10 items, fast to execute. If we can run lunch by the end of next month, we change the entire picture. The lunch service launched 6 weeks later and was, on its first day, completely chaotic. 3 orders came in wrong. One table waited 40 minutes for food that should have taken 20. Ruth spilled coffee on a rancher named Grover, who was gracious about it in the way that made the spilling somehow worse. Tessa was in the kitchen running 3 things too many simultaneously, and her voice, which was always controlled, cracked twice, once at herself, once at Warren, which she apologized for immediately and directly. At the end of the first lunch service, they sat in the empty dining room, Tessa, Rhett, Warren, Clara, Ruth, and said nothing for a full minute. Then Warren said, "Table assignments." "Yes," Tessa said. "That's the problem. If Clara takes the front 4 tables and Ruth takes the back 6, the traffic pattern doesn't cross," Tessa finished. "I know, I had it wrong." She rubbed her face with both hands. "I had the math wrong, and I didn't catch it until we were already in it." "It's day 1, Clara said. "Day 1 matters," Tessa said. "Grover is going to tell his ranch hands about the coffee." "Grover tipped Ruth double," Rhett said. Everyone looked at him. "I watched. He tipped her double. I think he's coming back." Ruth looked like she might expire from relief. Then she laughed, a short, real laugh that broke the tension in the room cleanly. Clara laughed next. Warren pressed his lips together and didn't quite manage to stop the corner of his mouth. Tessa looked at the ceiling, then she looked back at the table. "We fixed the table assignments tonight. Tomorrow we run it clean." She paused. "It was not a disaster." "It was not a disaster," Rhett confirmed. "It was bad. It was recoverable. There's a difference." She looked at him. Something passed between them that was too brief and too layered to name. The accumulated weight of months of this, of every decision and every setback and every night she hadn't slept, and every morning he'd shown up and put food in front of her because she'd forgotten to eat, all of it compressed into a single second of eye contact that neither of them acknowledged and neither of them forgot. "Fix the table assignments," she said. "I'll do the prep for tomorrow." They stayed until 9. Michaela came by with a bottle of something he'd been saving, and they sat around the prep table in the kitchen and drank from the bottle and talked through the lunch service with the clinical honesty of people who cared enough about the work to be unsentimental about where it had gone wrong. Warren had a notebook and wrote things down. Clara and Ruth added things that Tessa and Warren had missed because they'd been in the kitchen and couldn't see the front of the house. Hale walked past the front window sometime around 8 and looked in. Rhett saw him, just a shape in the lamplight outside, pausing for a moment and then moving on. He didn't say anything about it. There was nothing to say about it tonight. The second lunch service, 2 days later, ran clean. Not perfectly, yes. There was a moment with a delayed order that required Tessa to go out to a table herself and explain, which she did with a directness that somehow worked, the rancher in question telling her afterward that he appreciated being spoken to like a man who could handle a straight answer. But the table assignments worked, the traffic flowed, the food came out in the right order at the right time, and by the 3rd day, the dining room at noon was full. By the end of June, the lunch service was doing more covers than the dinner service had done in its first month. Douglas Hale, Rhett heard from Cobb, had called his dining room cook into a meeting and asked him why the alderman wasn't doing the same numbers. The cook apparently had told him that the problem wasn't the numbers, and Hale hadn't liked the answer. The hearth table kept going. Not easily. Nothing about it was easy, and Tessa would have distrusted easy if it had happened, because she'd learned what easy usually meant. A week after the lunch service stabilized, she hired 2 kitchen apprentices. A 16-year-old named Josie, who'd been working as a dishwasher at the saloon and who could taste a preparation once and tell you exactly what it needed, and a young man named Domingo who'd come up from New Mexico with a cattle drive and hadn't left because he didn't have anywhere better to go, and the kitchen at the hearth table had smelled like something worth staying for. Tessa taught them the way she'd taught herself. By explaining why not just what, by being direct about when something was wrong and equally direct when something was right. She was not warm in the way of someone performing warmth, but she was honest, which was harder to find and worth more. And Josie and Domingo both understood this by the end of the first week. "She's a good teacher," Warren told Rhett one afternoon when Tessa was in the front room going over the evening reservation list and couldn't hear. "The way she explains things, she doesn't talk down, she doesn't simplify. She just talks to you like you're capable of understanding if you pay attention." "She does that with everybody," Rhett said. "I know. That's what makes it good." Warren paused. "She worked for someone who treated her like she wasn't capable. You'd think that would make someone either insecure or overcorrect the other way. Be too easy, never critical. She's neither." Rhett looked toward the front room. "No," he said. "She's not." By August, the hearth table had a waiting list for Friday and Saturday dinner. By September, Crane, the railroad surveyor, had brought 3 separate parties, including a man from the territorial governor's office who'd asked Tessa, again, to come out of the kitchen, and had told her, standing up, again, that he intended to mention the restaurant in his report on economic development in the Bozeman region. She thanked him. She went back to the kitchen. Rhett watched her go and thought about a woman on a frozen ridge pointing a rifle at his chest and giving him broth when she had every reason not to, and about a hollow in the mountains where dry wood burned properly because she knew how to read weather and terrain and the slow language of things that could kill you if you stopped paying attention. He thought, she always knew this was in her, she just needed somewhere to put it. Hale had gone quiet in recent weeks. Not because he'd stopped watching, Rhett had no illusions about that, but because the thing he'd been trying to stop had gotten too large and too established to stop quietly, and Hale was, whatever else he was, not a stupid man. He was recalculating. Rhett could see it in the occasional paused shape outside the front window. The calculation was shifting from, how do I prevent this, to something else, something more dangerous. And Rhett kept that awareness in the back of his mind and didn't mention it to Tessa because she was sleeping again, finally, and the lines around her eyes had softened and he didn't want to put them back. There was time. There was still time to deal with what was coming when it came. On a September evening, after the last dinner service had ended, and the dining room was clean and the kitchen was shut down and everyone else had gone home, Tessa sat at the prep table in the kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold beside her and a piece of paper in front of her on which she was writing numbers. Rhett sat across from her reading a report from Cobb. After a while, she set down her pencil. "We're going to be all right," she said. He looked up. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the numbers on the paper. But her voice had the quality of something settled, something that had moved from uncertain to known. "Yes," he said. "The winter's going to be hard. The volumes will drop when the ranchers pull back to their spreads. We'll have to tighten." She paused. "But the base is there. The core customers are there. If we get through winter, we'll come out the other side stronger than we went in. We'll get through winter." She looked up at him then. The lamp on the prep table was the only light in the kitchen, and her face in it was tired and certain. And something else. Something that had been there for a while now, something he'd been watching grow through months of this, through every morning and every crisis and every moment she'd let him see something real rather than the version she managed for the world. "Thank you," she said. Not the mountain version, not the broth version. Something different, quieter, more specific. "For what?" She thought about it. "For being here when it mattered. For not making it about you." She picked up her cup, found it cold, set it back down. "You could have. A lot of men would have. Put their money in and decided that meant they got to run things. It was never my money to run things with." "I know. That's what I'm saying." She stood up and took her cup to the small basin. "Go home, deputy." "I'm not a deputy anymore, not officially." "Habit." She set the cup down and turned around. "Go home, Rhett." He folded the report. He stood up. He looked at her in the lamplight of a kitchen that they'd built together in a town that had been trying to decide what it was going to be above a dining room where people had eaten tonight and meant it. "You should sleep," he said. "I will. Actually sleep. I said I will." She reached past him to turn down the lamp. "Good night." "Good night, Tessa." He walked out through the front room and out onto Gallatin Street, and the September air was cold and clean, in the way that meant autumn was settling in for real, and winter was not far behind it. He looked up at the sign, the hearth table, Michaela's careful letters, and then he looked at the dark street and the lit windows of the town that was still figuring out what it was going to be. Whatever it was going to be, the hearth table was going to be part of it. He was as certain of that as he'd ever been of anything. He started walking. Behind him, the last lamp in the restaurant went out. Winter came in the way Montana winters always did. Not gradually, not with warning, but as a fact. One morning, the street outside the hearth table was October, and by afternoon it was something older and harder than October, and Rhett stood at the front window watching the first real snow come down on Gallatin Street and thought about a hollow in the Highlands where a woman had pointed a rifle at his chest and given him broth, and how that felt like a different life now, even though it had been less than a year. Tessa had been right about the winter volumes. The ranchers pulled back to their spreads, the trail traffic slowed, the casual dinner trade thinned to the core customers who came because they'd decided the hearth table was theirs in some sense. Crane still came, Pruitt still came. Cobb and his wife came every Friday without fail. The lunch service dropped to half capacity. The numbers were tight in the way Tessa had predicted, and she managed them with the same eyes-open practicality she managed everything, cutting what could be cut without cutting what mattered and holding the line on the things that were the whole point. Josie and Domingo stayed. Warren stayed. Clara and Ruth stayed, which was not something Rhett had taken for granted. Clara had a standing offer from the alderman that Hale had renewed twice, and each time she'd declined it. And Rhett didn't know what she'd said to Hale, but he suspected it was direct in the way of a woman who'd worked for Tessa Ashcroft long enough to learn what direct looked like. Hale made his move in November. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't quiet, and it wasn't the kind of thing you could ignore or manage around. He'd been recalculating since September, and what he'd calculated was that indirect pressure wasn't working and that he needed to change the nature of the problem. He went to the city council, 3 men, of whom 2 had eaten at his dining room regularly for years, and raised a formal complaint about the hearth table's operating license. The complaint cited, among other things, concerns about fire safety compliance, questions about the provenance of certain supplier relationships, and a vaguely worded concern about the character of the establishment's management that was so specifically designed to be unprovable that it was almost impressive in its construction. Rhett heard about it from Cobb on a Tuesday morning, and he went to the restaurant and told Tessa, and she sat down at the prep table and read the formal complaint document that Cobb had obtained a copy of, and when she finished, she set it down and was quiet for almost a full minute. "The fire safety citation refers to the flue inspection," she said. "Yes, the one Fielding tried to flag and then removed. Which means Hale knows what happened in that inspection. Which means Fielding told him." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "The supplier relationship question. That's about Garrett. He's implying we're getting supply from unverified sources. The Livingston man is verified. I have documentation." "I know." She looked at the document. "The character concern is nothing," Rhett said. "It's designed to be nothing you can respond to directly, which is the point of it." "I know what the point of it is." She looked up at him. Her face was the controlled face, the one she wore when what was underneath it was too large and too hot to let out without consequence. "He's going to the council with this." "He already went. The hearing is December 3rd. Silence. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. She stood up. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the alley where the snow was coming down steady and indifferent. Rhett waited. He'd learned to wait. "He's not wrong that 2 of the 3 council members will lean his way," she said. "Hale has fed them and flattered them for 3 years. That's real. That's not something I can argue away." She turned around. "What's the 3rd member?" "A man named Aldous Farrow. Came up from Texas 4 years ago, runs a dry goods operation on Main Street. Cobb says he's independent, genuinely independent, doesn't owe Hale anything, votes his conscience." "1 vote isn't enough." "No," Rhett said. "But 1 genuine vote and 2 men who are weighing their long-term interests rather than their immediate loyalties. That might be enough." He paused. "Bozeman is growing, Tessa. The men on that council know it's growing. They know the town is going to be something in 5 years that it isn't right now, and they know their reputations are going to be part of that story. What they need is a reason to see the long-term picture instead of the short-term one. She looked at him. You want to make a case to them? I want you to make a case. I want to be there. But the case has to be yours. She thought about it. He watched her think, really think, the way she did when it mattered, turning it over and looking at all the faces of it before she settled. I'm not going to beg, she said. I'm not asking you to beg. I'm not going to apologize for existing. Nobody's asking that either. Then what am I asking them? You're asking them to look at what you've built and decide what kind of town they want Bozeman to be. He kept his voice even. That's not begging. That's a question worth asking. She was quiet for another moment. Then she went to the drawer where she kept the financial records and pulled out a ledger and set it on the prep table and opened it. Then we need to show them the numbers, she said. What we've paid in taxes, what we've paid in wages, what our suppliers have earned from us, what our customers have spent here that they weren't spending anywhere else in Bozeman before we opened. She looked up. Can you get me the data from Cobb's office on business revenue contributions? By tomorrow. I'll need the supplier documentation from Livingston. I have it. And I want statements, she paused, from Crane, from Pruitt, from anyone who'll put their name to something that says what this place has meant to them. She paused again. Not testimonials. I don't want testimonials. I want honest statements from people who've been here and can say specifically what they saw. Crane will do it, Rhett said, without being asked twice. Then ask him. Done. The December 3rd hearing was held in the council room above the land office, a space that held 30 people comfortably and which on that morning held 47, because word had gotten around in the way that word always got around in a town the size of Bozeman, which was completely and quickly and in ways nobody could entirely account for. Crane was there, Pruitt was there, Cobb was there in his official capacity. Michaela was there, still and serious, his large hands folded on his knees. Josie and Domingo were there, standing at the back because they hadn't gotten there early enough for seats. Clara and Ruth were there, Warren was there, in the good coat he wore when he was trying to look like the kind of person who owned a good coat. Hale was there with 2 associates and a lawyer from Helena he'd apparently telegraphed for, which told Rhett that Hale had been planning this for longer than 3 weeks and had put real money into it. Tessa sat at the front table across from the 3 council members, and she wore her good dress, and her hair was done, and she sat with her back straight and her hands visible on the table in front of her, and she looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had done nothing wrong and knew it and wasn't afraid of the room. Hale's lawyer spoke first. He was thorough and professional, and the fire safety citation was presented with documentation that was technically accurate if you didn't know the context, and the supplier questions were framed as concerns rather than accusations, and the character language was deployed with the kind of careful vagueness that was designed to make the listener's imagination do the work. It took 20 minutes. At the end of it, the 2 council members who owed Hale were leaning slightly forward. Then Tessa spoke. She didn't use many words. That was the thing about it that Rhett would remember most clearly afterward. She didn't fill the air with language the way the lawyer had, didn't perform conviction. She just said what was true, clearly and in sequence, and let the truth do what it did. She said, the fire inspection was conducted over 4 hours by an inspector who flagged 14 items, 4 of which were not in the city code. She said, she had the documentation from a deputy marshal who was present at the inspection and could account for every item on the original list and every item that was removed. She said, her suppliers were documented, licensed, and available for inspection at any time the council wished to conduct one. She said, she had paid her taxes, her wages, and her debts on time every time, since the day she opened. Then she set the ledger on the table and walked the council through the numbers. Not all of them. The relevant ones. The ones that told the story of a business that had built something real in less than a year. What had been paid in city taxes. What had been paid in wages to Bozeman residents. What the supplier relationships had generated. What the customer traffic represented in economic terms for the broader community. Farrow, the independent council member, was leaning forward by the 3rd page. Then she said the thing that Rhett hadn't known she was going to say because she hadn't told him, because she'd written it the night before alone in the kitchen and decided she didn't need to run it by anyone. She said, I want to address the character concern directly, because I think it deserves a direct answer even though it was raised indirectly. She paused. I am a woman who came to this town with savings from 4 years of hard work and a plan I'd been building for longer than that. I have faced every obstacle that has been put in front of this business, and I have not broken any law, harmed any person, or misrepresented anything about what the hearth table is or what it does. She looked at the two council members who were leaning toward Hale. She looked at them specifically and didn't look away. The question of character being raised in this room today is not about me. It is about what kind of town you want this to be. Whether Bozeman is a place where someone who works honestly and builds something real is protected, or a place where the established and the powerful can use the machinery of government to remove competition they find inconvenient. She paused one last time. That's the question in front of you. I trust you to answer it honestly. The room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next thing, the specific quiet of people who have just heard something and are sitting with it. The vote was 2-1 in favor of dismissing the complaint. The two council members who owed Hale took their time getting there. There was a recess and some conversation, and Rhett watched them across the room talking with the low urgency of men recalculating in real time. But they got there. Farrow had voted to dismiss in under a minute. Hale left without speaking to anyone. His lawyer followed. The associates followed after that, and then the room started talking all at once in the particular way of people who'd been holding their breath. Tessa sat at the front table for a moment after the vote, not moving. Then Crane was shaking her hand and Pruitt after him, and Clara was crying a little, which she would have been embarrassed about if Ruth hadn't been doing the same thing, so it evened out. Michaela put a large hand on Rhett's shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly right. Rhett waited until the room had thinned before he went to Tessa. She was standing by the window that looked out onto Main Street, and the snow was coming down again, steady and permanent, and Bozeman was doing its business below them in the way it always did regardless of what was happening in the rooms above it. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, 2-1. "I heard the vote." He stood beside her and they both looked out at the snow. "Is it over?" he said. "With Hale." She thought about it honestly. "He's not going to try this again," she said. "Not the council, not officially. He spent too much on this and it went badly for him." She paused. "He's going to keep watching, keep waiting. If we make a serious mistake, he'll be there." She turned from the window. "So we don't make serious mistakes. Simple as that." Nobody said it was simple. She picked up her coat from the chair. "Come on. Warren's been holding the lunch service together alone for 3 hours, and he's going to need help." They walked back to Gallatin Street through the snow, and Tessa opened the restaurant door and went into the kitchen without breaking stride, and Rhett heard Warren say something she replied to. And then the kitchen was running again. And that was that. 3 years passed. The way years pass in a place that's actually living. Not smoothly, not as a montage, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that add up to something when you look back at them. Hale's dining room closed in the second year, not because of the hearth table directly. The Denver cook left, and the replacement wasn't the same, and Bozeman had grown enough that the men who'd eaten at the Alderman out of obligation now had a choice, and they were making it. Hale sold the hotel to a railroad interest and left for Portland and was not missed by anyone who talked to Rhett about it. The hearth table expanded into the building next door in the spring of the second year. A modest expansion, just 4 more tables and a private dining room that ranchers used for business meetings, and that Crane booked for a territorial development conference that brought 40 people to Bozeman from as far as San Francisco. The conference was written up in 3 newspapers. 2 of them mentioned the restaurant. Josie became the morning sous chef. This happened without ceremony. Tessa simply started giving her more, and Josie took more. And one day the arrangement was official, without anyone having formally decided to make it official. She was 19 years old and had opinions about preparation that she defended with the specific confidence of someone who'd been taught to trust her own palate. Tessa argued with her sometimes, not unhappily. The arguments were the kind that made the food better, and both of them knew it. Domingo stayed too, though his path went sideways in a way none of them expected. He turned out to have an extraordinary instinct for pastry, which was not something any of them had anticipated from a man who'd arrived on a cattle drive and stayed because the kitchen smelled interesting. Tessa gave him afternoons to experiment. What came out of those afternoons was put on the menu, and the menu changed because of it. And people who came from out of territory came back specifically because of what Domingo had built in those afternoon hours. Warren left in the 3rd year. Not badly. Not the way Barlow had driven Tessa out, nothing like that. He left because a restaurant in Livingston had approached him about running their kitchen, and it was his own kitchen, his own menu, his own walls. He told Tessa on a Tuesday morning, and she sat with it for a moment and then said, "Good, take the job." She gave him 2 weeks of preparation, every technique she'd refined over 3 years, written in a notebook that she'd been keeping since the mountain. She gave him the notebook. He kept it for the rest of his working life. Rhett stayed as a deputy in the technical sense, but the work had become something different, less tracking, more the slow business of a town building itself into something permanent. He knew the suppliers and the builders and the ranchers and the men who were deciding what Bozeman's next 10 years were going to look like. He was not a figure of power in the obvious sense, but he was a figure of presence, and in a growing town that mattered in ways that were hard to quantify, but real. He and Tessa were not simple about each other. That was the most honest way to say it. Whatever was between them had been building since a frozen ridge in January and had not resolved itself cleanly into something named and settled, because neither of them was built for easy resolutions, and both of them had been burned by the assumption that good things came without cost. They worked together every day. They argued sometimes about the finances and the staffing decisions, and occasionally about things that weren't really about the finances or the staffing decisions at all. They had dinners that were sometimes just dinners and sometimes something else that neither of them named. The naming happened eventually on a February evening in the 4th year, when the restaurant was closed and the kitchen was clean and the snow was coming down outside the way it had been coming down when they walked into Bozeman for the first time. They were at the prep table with coffee, a habit so established by then that neither of them thought about it. And Tessa was looking at expansion plans for a second location in Livingston, and Rhett was reading a report and neither of them was talking. And then Tessa set down her plans and looked at him. "Rhett," she said. He looked up. She had the expression, the one with too many things in it, but this time she didn't manage it down into something more controlled. She let it be there. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say that for about 2 years, and that's the best I have." He set down the report. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight of the kitchen that they'd built, in the restaurant that had changed what the town thought was possible. "You would have done it anyway," he said. "You would have found a way. You're not someone who stops." "Maybe," she said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." He reached across his table. He put his hand over hers, which were resting flat on the expansion plans, the way they always rested on things she was thinking through carefully. She looked at his hand and then at him. "Me too," he said. That was the naming. Not a speech, not a dramatic declaration, just two people at a kitchen table in the late evening being honest with each other, which was the most natural thing in the world for them and the most they'd ever needed. There is a thing that the frontier does to people, and it is not the thing that stories usually say it does. Stories say the frontier makes people hard, makes them solitary, makes them into the kind of self-sufficient myth that doesn't need anyone and doesn't ask for anything. And there is some truth in that. The frontier does strip away anything that can't survive the actual conditions. And some of what gets stripped is softness, and some of it is illusion, and some of it is the comfortable belief that you know what you're made of. But what the frontier actually shows you, if you survive it long enough, is not that you don't need anyone. It shows you exactly the opposite. It shows you, in the specific and unignorable language of cold and hunger and exposure, that the single human alone against the wilderness is just a body that's going to run out of heat eventually. What keeps people alive is not independence. It is the fire someone else built. It is the broth someone hands you when your hands are shaking too hard to hold it properly. It is the voice that says, "Talk to me," when the cold has gotten inside your head and you're starting to go somewhere dangerous. Rhett Mercer had been a man who moved alone for most of his adult life and had called it self-sufficiency and sometimes even called it virtue. He understood, looking back from the 4th year of a partnership that had changed everything he'd expected his life to become, that what he'd actually been doing was carrying the weight of a thing that was too heavy for one person and calling the strain character. He'd been doing that long enough that the strain had started to feel normal. Tessa Ashcroft had been doing the same thing. 4 years on a mountain, 4 years of being right about everything and having nowhere to put the rightness, 4 years of building toward a future while the present was a hollow in the highlands and a fire she tended alone and the extraordinary food she made that no one ate but her. What they had built together was not a fairy story. The restaurant was successful, but it had lean months and difficult decisions and a temperamental stove in year 3 that cost them 2 weeks of service and a repair bill that made the finances uncomfortable for longer than either of them liked. They disagreed about hiring twice and were both right once each, which was about as good as disagreements went. Josie burned a preparation so badly one evening that the kitchen filled with smoke and 2 tables had to be moved to the front walk, which was funny later and not funny at the time. None of it was smooth. None of it was the version where everything works out because the people were good enough to deserve it. It worked out, to the extent that it worked out, because they kept going. Because when one of them hit the wall, the other one was there, not to take over, but to hold the line while the first one found their footing again. Because Tessa had learned that asking for help was not the same as giving up what made her who she was, and Rhett had learned that staying in one place was not the same as losing the thing that had made him a good marshal: the patience, the willingness to sit with difficulty, the refusal to take a shortcut that would cost you later. In the 5th year, Tessa trained a young woman from a ranch family south of Bozeman who had come in asking about kitchen work with the specific desperation of someone who had no other option and the specific talent of someone who was going to be remarkable whether or not anyone gave them the opportunity. Her name was May, and she was 17, and Tessa saw something in her in the first week that reminded her of standing in the kitchen at Alderman's in Helena at 20 years old and knowing, with complete certainty, that she could do this and more than this if anyone would let her. So Tessa let her. And what May became, over the years that followed, and the cooks that May trained, and the kitchens those cooks eventually ran in towns across the territory. That was the part of the story that was bigger than either Rhett or Tessa could have planned for or predicted, the part that made what they'd built on Gallatin Street something that outlasted them, and the specific circumstances that had made it possible. But that was later. In the 5th year, May was still learning, and Tessa was still teaching, and Rhett was still there every morning and every evening that the restaurant needed him, which was most mornings and most evenings. And the sign above the door still read "The Hearth Table" in Michaela's careful letters, weathered now from the years but readable from the street. Tessa came out of this kitchen one evening and found Rhett standing in the empty dining room looking up at the sign through the front window. She stopped beside him. They stood there together looking at it. The letters, the light coming through the glass, the snow just starting outside. "I think about the hollow sometimes," she said. "The first night." "So do I." "I almost didn't let you stay." She said it without guilt, just the fact of it. "I stood there for about 30 seconds after you sat down at that fire, and I thought about telling you to move on." "I know," he said. "I saw you thinking about it." She looked at him. "You saw that? You have a very readable face when you're deciding something important." She looked back at the sign. 30 seconds, she said. "Everything we built from one decision in 30 seconds. He thought about the cold that had been a presence on that ridge, and the particular smell of wood smoke in winter air, and the broth that had tasted like survival. He thought about 4 days coming down through the snow, and a woman who'd read an avalanche from 200 yards and never broke stride. He thought about Pruitt's handshake and Hale's smile, and the fire inspection, and the December hearing and the prep table at midnight, and the coffee that went cold because neither of them ever remembered to drink it while it was hot. The 30 seconds were the easy part, he said. Everything after was the work. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and went back toward the kitchen. "Come on," she said. "Josie needs the closing inventory checked, and I'm not doing it twice." He followed her. That was still the right thing to do. It had been the right thing to do since January of the year they met, and he understood now that it was going to keep being the right thing to do for as long as he was paying attention, which he intended to be for a very long time. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the snow kept falling on Gallatin Street, on the sign that Michaela had built from a single plank of Douglas fir, on the town that was becoming what it was going to be. Neither of them looked back. There was inventory to do. There was always more work. That was the point. That had always been the point.